But if you would, open in your scriptures to Romans 13, 1 through 4. And while you're doing that, let me kind of give you an overview of where we're going today. First talk is kind of the why of politics. Why do we care about political engagement? Second talk is going to be talking about the more specific application, like the what or how of politics. But we want to lay that first foundational layer, which is the why. Why do we care? Then we're going to go to the applied area. And then the third talk this afternoon is, if the first two are kind of oriented towards you and your individual capacity as a believer in our political society, the third talk is how then does the church, the gathered local church, understand its place in the mission, understand politics in relationship to its mission as the gathered and local church. But if you would, read with me in Romans 13, 1 through 4. And this is going to be kind of our base text that's going to shape how we're seeing all that we're going to be talking about today, even though while we'll jump around other areas of Scripture. Romans 13, 1 through 4. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. The first thing I want to establish at the outset is that Christianity affirms the value of the government. It affirms the role of the state to play a positive good. The idea that we would be Christian anarchists, which that actually is a thing in Christian political thought, is actually a contradiction in terms, because God has established the governing authorities for our good. It's for our good. But that raises the question, as believers, then how do we relate to this institution that we believe is necessary, but also a source of frustration, something that we are called to pay allegiance to, but not give an ultimate allegiance to? And it's been in the history of, in the unveiling of the world's affairs, where giving too much power to the state, investing too much hope into the state, has created incredible problems in various regimes, from authoritarianism to totalitarianism. So how do we relate to the state while not relating to it improperly? And I want to introduce this concept, maybe the big concept you want to put down in your notes, this idea of what we call the Ordo Amoris. Ordo Amoris, O-R-D-O-A-M-O-R-I-S. Big fancy phrase. It comes from Augustine, one of the earliest voices in Christian thought. And what Augustine is getting at is this idea of what he calls the order of loves. Ordo, amoris, loves. The order of our loves. And I think Augustine helps us frame how we think about our relationship to the state. That we are to honor the state, but not give a type of honor and a type of affection that the state isn't owed. And this came home to me a few years ago. Growing up, I was a big fan of Charles Colson. Colson Center, I'm sure many of us in here know who Chuck Colson is. He wrote a book called Kingdoms in Conflict, later reissued the book as God and Government. And I got a copy of God and Government, and I just absorbed it. And I had a chance to meet Chuck Colson in 2009 when the Southern Baptist Convention was in Louisville, Kentucky. And he signed my book in a way that registers with the Ordo Amoris of what we're going to get at. He said, "Dear Andrew, love your country, but love your God more." And I would submit to you that that is the foundation of where we want to begin, that you can love your country. It is not a contradiction in terms to be a Christian American. I love this country. I love this country the best when I give to this country or ascribe to this country the proper type of love it is owed. So we love God first, and that subordinates all other loves in the proper place that they are to be ordered. Meaning that, as Christians, we can affirm the value of our country, affirm the value of politics, that we want to avoid this idea, maybe you've heard this phrase, that we're so heavenly minded that we're no earthly good. That sometimes we can adopt a philosophy of, well, this is all just like rearranging chairs on the Titanic, so who really cares? It's all going down. So let's just kind of whistle Dixie while the thing's burning down. I think that is an irresponsible political ethic, that to be a Christian does not evacuate us from the responsibility of stewarding this authority that God has granted to us as citizens, that in an American context, what do? We channel that authority into representatives who are not, they have an authority over us, but what do? They derive their authority from the people. The people, if they're more justly organized, understand that true authority comes from God, that we are not the universal sovereign ourselves, but all of this is under the umbrella and authority of a God who is sovereign. Because politics really matters. You often hear the idea that ideas have consequences. I would say that political ideas have massive consequences. Has anyone here been to Berlin, Germany? Anyone who's traveled to Berlin knows the divide between the East and the West. Now, it was kind of the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc. And there's not only an ideological distinction between West Berlin and East Berlin. If you're paying attention to what's happening in Berlin, there is an even architectural difference between East Berlin and West Berlin. West Berlin, you have the free market, you have people kind of creating and building according to what they want. There's an emphasis on beauty. In East Berlin, what do you have? You have Soviet architecture. Does anyone know why the Soviets had the architecture that they did? It was what's called brutalism as a form of architecture. And brutalism is the idea that you are building imposing, physically intimidating, bland, generic buildings that communicate raw power. And what do we know about the Soviet system? It was a system meant to depersonalize the human being and to personalize the state, to vest all of the power in the state as the supreme authority at the cost of the liberty of the people. And that even got manifested down to the level of its architecture in terms of reminding the people what they're about as a governing philosophy. That you are a subject to the state, and we're going to build buildings that remind you of your smallness up against the state. When we look at ideas having consequences and political ideas having consequences, in the 20th century alone, scholars estimate that 100 million individuals were killed as a result of communism taking force in the Eastern Bloc. Politics isn't everything, but let me submit to you that it is not nothing either. how we order ourselves as a society can be the difference between societies that are free and thriving and societies that are brutalist and opposed to human dignity. So that what we see is that a vision for ordering society always has consequences. It's not value neutral. It's not morally neutral. It's always moving in one direction or the other. And that's why today's political debates that we are having over issues like abortion and transgenderism, they appear to us as merely political debates. But I would submit to you that these are deeply theological debates that have turned into political debates. And as our politics has become more religious, and it is, even by those who don't consider themselves religious, guess what has happened? Our religion has necessarily become more political. Because we're no longer just disagreeing on sugar subsidies. We're not disagreeing on tax rates. We're disagreeing on things that sane societies ought to have a consensus and common purpose around, which is, what does it mean to be a human? Do you have a right to your own life? What is the definition of a male and a female? What is the definition of a marriage? Because again, political ideas have ramifications and consequences. In 1992, Justice Anthony Kennedy penned a decision in Planned Parenthood v. Casey reaffirming a right to abortion out of the 1973 case Roe v. Wade, where he defined what liberty meant. Some of you might have heard of this phrase before, but he goes on to define liberty as the right for everyone to define their own, he defines liberty as the right to define one's own concept of existence. Okay? That sounds great, right? Well, everyone gets to figure out for themselves how they're going to live their life. The problem with that is that this is born of what we call an expressive individualism, what scholars call it. Who's heard phrases like, live your truth, you do you? That's Anthony Kennedy jurisprudence. In a 1992 decision, doing what? Working its way out into the culture. We often ask ourselves, how do politics and culture relate? Which one is downstream from the other? The answer is they're mutually reinforcing. Politics impacts the culture impacts our politics. So what has happened today is that today's political climate is attacking what we're going to be talking about as creation, order, institutions. In fact, if you want to write down the phrase creation, order. And I would submit to you that the most important thing we can do as believers today is regain a concept of creation order. And this language of creation order actually comes from Martin Luther. He talked about this in his canon of theology, creation order, that when God creates, he imposes structure on creation. He imposes certain elements within creation that are of his divine decree, that are factual, that they exist, that they correspond to reality, and that all societies, if they want to be healthy societies, have to organize themselves according to the reality of these creation ordinances or these creation institutions. And if societies degrade these creation institutions, guess what? You seek to have a political society. You no longer have a culture. So when we look at Genesis 1 and 2, and we're going to be kind of hovering in Genesis 1 and 2 a lot today. We're going to be hovering in Jeremiah 29 a lot, Romans 13. When we look at Genesis 1 and 2, which is the building block for where we do our political theology from, we see some things come into existence right off the bat. We see, first and foremost, our existence is a reality. Male and female, he creates them. Okay, well, we're going to talk about male and female in a second, but what do we see first and foremost? He creates us. So existence is a creation order principle. What's that going to do? That's going to call into question the legitimacy of abortion. That if God creates, guess what? You have a right to your life. If we have regimes that design our laws to where your life is potentially always an option rather than something that's an inalienable right, what do you have? You have sowing instability and destruction right into the heart of your political order. So you have existence. You have this notion of identity. in Genesis 1 and 2. There are things in Genesis that are beneath the text that we don't immediately see, but when we see Genesis 1 and 2 in a broader context, it's filling out so much. We have existence, we have identity. What is our culture longing for after right now? It's longing for this category of identity, that we are an identity-seeking people. The question is, where will we get our identity? How do you even define what an identity is? Genesis 1 and 2 immediately says, male and female, he creates them. Meaning that at the foundation of political societies is not just our existence, but it's our identity as what? Not as an asexual robot or automaton. It's that we come into our existence as either male or female, and that is an absolutely essential reality that political communities must recognize. Okay, what does that rule out? It rules out the gender madness. Genesis 1 and 2, what else do we have? We have the notion that family comes into being. Male and female, he creates them. Then do what? Be fruitful, multiply, exercise dominion. The family in Christian political thought is one of the key institutions to think about what politics is, because everyone comes into this world as an individual, yes, but you come into this world as an individual via the union of a man and a woman because of our biology. The question is whether or not our society is not going to have you just come into existence via a man and a woman, but whether you're going to come into existence in the confines of where that man and woman are husband and wife, united together with one another, for one another, for the mutual benefit of one another, and for the mutual bringing forth of children into our society who are given the best opportunity to survive and thrive. Notice, Genesis 1 and 2 is speaking about the fundamental pillars and building blocks upon which society, and we're not even talking politics yet necessarily, we're talking about what must you have in a society for that society to function in a healthy way. You have to have an appreciation for existence, stable concepts of identity. You have to have an appreciation for the family. And then underneath Genesis 1 and 2 is this notion that it's all under the canopy of God's authority and God's sovereignty and God's glory, meaning that every single human being is a divine-seeking creature because of how God has made us. To be made in God's image means by nature you are a truth-seeking person, you are a meaning-seeking person, you are a purpose-seeking person. Properly understood, you derive that from God, which means you need to have the liberty to pursue God. Speaks to what? That speaks to liberty, that speaks to freedom, that speaks to religious freedom. Because everything around us, according to Genesis 1 and 2, is a mirror or reflection of meaning, morality, and purpose. C.S. Lewis famously said one time that you've never met a mere mortal because we are immortal beings. It's a question of whether you will have an immortality to eternal life or an immortality unto death. I would say something similar to what Lewis is saying here. I would say that you've never encountered a world or political society not governed by some conception of the good. The question is, what is that society's concept of the good? That is the key debate politically in our society today. What is the good life? What does it mean to be free? A little teaser for tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about what does it mean to be truly free as a Christian. So come back for tomorrow. What is the good? Everyone has a definition of the good. What is it? Because we have to ask the question, by what standards? By man's laws? By man's standards? Or God's laws? Or God's standards? Because ultimately, listen, this is the Christian's pursuit of politics and caring about politics is not just for the sake of our power and our privilege. Properly understood, if we're grounded in a Genesis 1 and 2 worldview, we care about political engagement because we are concerned about governing authorities that are duly appointed by God, recognizing the truth and realities of Genesis 1 and 2 and building healthy laws off a true account of how we understand the world to be from Genesis 1 and 2. So, big question, why do Christians care about politics? Here's the answer. Why do we care? Because we are called to steward or to take care of God's creation in conformity with his design and plan for it. Lecture 2, we're going to talk a little bit about natural law theory. That's an important concept in Christian political thought. But this notion that there is a design, there is a structure, there is a pattern to God's world. We are called to steward that, recognize it, make sure our laws reflect the truths of those designed realities. And this includes government, which God has established for the purpose of maintaining order and justice. It is honoring God's intention for his creation that justice and human flourishing is realized. Our neighbor is better loved. Our societies are more prone to flourishing. Love your neighbor as yourself has a political application, meaning pass laws that are intentionally designed to protect the well-being of your neighbor. And here's the beauty of the current moment that we're living in. And I think this is the opportunity that we have as believers. I think that we are in a target-rich environment for the truth of the gospel to impact society and to impact political communities in profound ways. You know why? Because a lot of people who aren't even Christians are waking up and seeing that late-stage terminal types of secularism and progressivism and unbelief are sowing discord and destruction in its wake. Joe Rogan, March of 2024, says this: the problem with living in a secular society that has a lot of people who are atheists, who have no belief system, is that you find a belief system, and that a lot of these people call themselves atheists, and they subscribe to the religion of woke. You know, their God is equity and inclusiveness. Their God is this ideology that they think you have to subscribe to. And here's why it's spooky, Rogan says. He says, human beings seem to have a very strong desire for some sort of order and form and some sort of pattern that they can follow, which seems to be the right way to go. And they can be led. They can be led by cults. They can be led by groups of people. They can be led by, intolerant governments and evil armies and corrupt politicians. Fundamentally, they can be led. He goes on to say this: but I think as time rolls on, people are going to understand the need to have some sort of divine structure to things, some sort of belief in the sanctity of love and truth. And a lot of that comes from religion. A lot of people's moral compass and the guidelines they've followed to live a just and righteous life have come from religion. Joe Rogan, the non-Christian, says this: we need Jesus for real. Now, the problem is that Joe Rogan wants the morality of Jesus without Jesus. If we're just after political morality, that's not enough. Political morality is a necessary but insufficient condition to man's greatest need. It's not just morality, it's not just political morality, it's that man is at odds with their creator and they need ultimate reconciliation. But do you hear someone here like Joe Rogan? I mean, this is a target-rich environment guy. It's like, bro, come on. Yes, you need Jesus, not just because you want to love your neighbor as yourself, which is good and Jesus says so, but because Jesus offers you the abundant life. But individuals like him are waking up and recognizing something has gone awry in our society, and it's causing a lot of people to wake up. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the second talk, but we are living in a target-rich environment. So I have about an hour left, and I have 15 truths. All of that was kind of my intro. Can you believe it? By the way, this is going to be kind of an informal, fun teaching period. I'm not kind of being sermonic this morning. We're just kind of being more informal. 15 truths. These are going to be kind of rapid fire, okay? Kind of 15 truths for the why of politics. First off, you have to care about politics because every single person is political. You may not conceive of yourself as political, but you are. Now, when we hear political, what our minds tend to go to is, are you of Fox or are you of MSNBC? We tend to collapse politics into punditry, which it necessarily includes punditry, but politics is fundamentally, and here's a definition for us, okay? Politics is how we as human beings go about the process of organizing our lives around common goods, goals, and values in whatever setting we are in, including government. It's about bringing order to society so that we can do what? So that we can order our lives, order the lives of our families, so that what can happen? So that we can reach our true purpose, that families can reach their true purpose. Even non-Christian philosophers like Aristotle, he called us, because he was not a Christian, he referred to us as political animals, because what he was getting after is, I think, a common grace kind of natural law truth is that we just are the types of beings who are seeking to figure out how to order our life for the sake of our productivity, for our fruitfulness, for our flourishing. Okay, I think this is speaking to a Genesis 1 and 2 reality. Male and female, he makes them. Be fruitful, multiply, then what? Exercise dominion. Theologians refer to that as the cultural mandate. That you are meant to get married. You're meant to have babies. You're meant to have a vocation that you give yourself to, that you can apply your skillfulness and your gifts for the sake of crafting your world into the direction that it ought to go in. So politics is not just Republicans versus Democrats. It's about the structure of how we understand how we are ordering our societies together. So we're zeroing out on what politics actually is. Second truth is that government is a divine institution authorized by God. We read this from Romans 13 already, that God has a place for the role of government in our life. That the goal of any earthly political regime is to recognize the inherent rights of human beings that are made in God's image, promote systems of equal justice under the law, allow individuals to reach and experience the common good. We're going to talk about the common good here in a little bit. The common good is a very important concept in the history of Christian political thought that we've kind of forgotten about. But the common good is a very important thing, that government is overseeing society, not because it's totalitarian and involved in every element of society, but it's creating laws that effectively are best designed if they get out of the way and allow individuals and families to cooperate meaningfully so that families and individuals and universities and churches and whatever institutions in society can do what each is called to do in their own sphere. That is why God establishes law, or government. So Christian anarchy is a contradiction in terms. Jesus says in Matthew 22:21, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. That's a monumentally huge statement in the history of political philosophy that even non-Christian political philosophers recognize, because Jesus in Matthew 22 is actually decoupling divine authority from the state, which in his time, the state or the Caesars were referred to as God-like. And so Jesus is saying, no, the state has a just authority, but it's a derived authority that comes from God. Any state or official who thinks that power self-emanates from the state itself and not from God is a candidate, an official, or a political party that's eventually going to find itself into totalitarianism. Why? Because if you do not recognize God as the Lord, you're going to put yourself in God's place. You're going to see yourself as omnicompetent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, all of the omnis, right? And you're going to try to ape and mirror God, but you're going to do so fallibly because guess what? Human beings are fallible. But guess what? You have no check on your authority because you are your own authority. So if people get in your way, what do you do with people who get in your way? Dispense with them. All of this comes from a recognition that God is ultimate. Our declaration actually gets at this truth very well. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Now, I'm not here to tell you that all of the founders were evangelical born-again Christians. They weren't. They were operating from a moral ecology that was undoubtedly informed by the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of which was human beings are subject to a creator, and it is the recognition of that creator-creature distinction that is absolutely fundamental for just political societies. This means if government exists and for a purpose, it means it's not omnicompetent. It's not meant to do a whole lot of things well. The government is not meant to be your counselor. Government is not meant to be your mother or father. The government does a few things and can do things well. You know what it can do well? Tax you and kill you. That's about it. And that gets to my third point, is that government's role is primarily what we call protectionist and preservative, rather than expansionist and all-encompassing. That God has prescribed, I think, pretty narrow parameters about what government is designed to do. As I said a second ago, man will love God or the state, and if it loves the state, it will impute God-like attributes to the state. Because guess what? If you don't have God, what then do you have in the people? You have the people who are going to channel divine-like impulses into the one mechanism that can act like God but not be God, which is what? The state. And when you see people investing all of this like hope and change and the joy and the vibes into the action of the state, you should watch out. Because an all-encompassing state that wants to get more involved in your life is exceeding and transgressing the boundaries of what the state is actually designed to do well. This is not Republican conservative talking points. I'm convinced this is biblical truth. So this means that the state is concerned not with the spiritual good, but with the common good. Now, the state, I think, should leave room for religious liberty so that we can figure out the nature of the spiritual good ourselves and not have the state dictate that to us. But the state has, and this is very important, the state has never been commissioned in the New Testament to be a vehicle for gospel proclamation. The church is the vehicle for gospel proclamation. We as Christians need to not ascribe too much authority to the state over spiritual matters, because when the state gets involved in spiritual matters, like an established church over in England that has so-called the ideal Christian nationalist regime, what do you have in the ideal Christian nationalist regime? You have unbelief and secularism baptized by the Church of England. You have in Finland, Päivi Räisänen a member of parliament who is an evangelical Christian, who is penalized and harassed by her state for putting up a verse about homosexuality in Romans 1 during Pride Month over in Finland, and goes to jail over it, and gets criminalized for it. Okay, what's fascinating here is that Finland actually has a state church, a Lutheran church. What is the value of a state church that's persecuting evangelical belief? So we don't want to invest too much in the eyes of the state pertaining to spiritual matters, because it's pertaining to temporal matters only, to laws that cause us to thrive as human beings. Number 4, government is to identify evil and to protect citizens against it. Government is to identify evil and protect citizens against it. 1 Peter 2 talks about how the government has been designed to praise that which is good and to condemn that which is evil. Meaning that we do want the government neutral on some things. I do not want the government prescribing to me whether we are to have Coke or Pepsi. The answer is Coke, for those who are interested. It can be indifferent and neutral on some matters, but not on all things. The state has to have a correct definition of what marriage is, of what life is, of what a man and a woman is. What does the government have to do? And these are themes we're going to be talking about all day today. The government has an obligation to recognize the truths of creation order set forward in Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 and 2 truths form the foundation of natural law morality. Natural law morality sets the foundation for political morality. So government has to identify what is actually evil and protect citizens against it. The worst type of situation is when you have government who, woe to those who call evil good and good evil, Isaiah 5, who in the state of California, if your child wants to transition and you don't affirm that transition, your child's taken from your home. Okay, that's a perversion, that's an inversion of God's command for government. The deprivation of parental rights is an attack on God's order. Number 5. See, we're being fast, I promise. Number 5, Christians are to be good citizens. 1 Timothy 2, 1 through 2. What are we called to do? We're called to pray for those who are in authority. What's fascinating is you keep reading in 1 Timothy 2, it says, pray for those who are in authority so that what? So that we can lead quiet lives of godliness. Later on in the chapter, because God wants all people to come to a saving knowledge of faith of who Jesus is. So I think there's a formula kind of in 1 Timothy 2 where it's like, no, we pray for those who are in authority, and we should pray diligently, even for authorities who we don't necessarily even like. We pray for them to have wisdom and justice, which includes getting out of the way and allowing the church to be the church. To allow us to live quiet lives of ordinary routineness that accords with the worldview of Genesis 1 and 2. So we should be mindful of how we find ourselves talking about government, how we find ourselves talking about our elected officials. That doesn't mean they're beyond criticism. Trust me, they are. But it's ascribing a degree of respect and honor even in how we make our criticisms. Number 6, I mentioned this once already, we're going to say it now, that ensuring the common good is one of the primary purpose of politics. Now, I mentioned this is a very important concept in the history of Christian political thought. What is it? The common good, and this is one of these phrases I hope you write down and you walk out of here today with a greater understanding of. The common good is the set of conditions in society that allows individuals, groups, and institutions to flourish, each according to their purpose. So we want government to set up policies that allow families to prosper so that their good can be achieved. I want non-Christian families to thrive as how families are meant to thrive. I want good laws in place. In the same way that a baseball team is fielded and designed in order to win a game, the reason that the government fields itself is to set up access to the common good so that human beings can encounter and reach their flourishing. I think we can define the common good. Another way of it is neighbor love in the aggregate. Thinking about, I want to pass laws that benefit my neighbor everywhere. And I can't love my neighbor each in a particular way because there are too many neighbors for me to love and get to know personally. I can't intervene in every person's life. But what I can do is work for laws that are meant to be beneficial to every single person so that they can thrive and flourish. Number 7. It is appropriate and good to allow one's religious convictions to shape your political convictions. We often hear the phrase, separation of church and state, right? We often hear the phrase, you cannot legislate morality. Well, guess what? Everyone's morality is being legislated to some extent. It's a question of whose morality is being legislated. Now, it's entirely appropriate for our worldview, our biblical worldview, to shape our political instincts and our political viewpoints. Simply because if we're thinking about religion and politics, there's something in between politics, or there's something in between religion and politics that we often omit or forget, which is ethics. So, religion informs your ethics. Ethics then inform your politics. That's the formula. Religion, ethics, politics. Now, not all of our religious convictions need to be enacted into law. And here's what I mean by that. We don't want our views on the Lord's Supper and baptism enacted into law. Sounds kind of bizarre, right? Why? Because those are ordinances that relate to the life of the church only. We don't need laws on that. What do we need good laws for? Those Genesis 1 and 2 realities. Because those are not strictly what we would call ecclesial ordinances. They're natural law creation ordinances. So we need the state to have a proper understanding of what it means to exist, what it means to have a right to life, what it means to be a man and a woman, what it means to be married. But again, that is natural law morality grounded in eternal law, discoverable by natural law, that then what? Human law has to enact. That sounds a little academic. What does that mean? Applied. Go with me to the letter from a Birmingham jail from Martin Luther King Jr. He's in jail for protesting racial supremacist laws in Alabama. He writes a letter to some clergy defending his actions. He's trying to explain why he did what he did in opposing these racial supremacist laws. And he says, the reason I opposed these laws was because these laws violate the natural law. All human law must accord with the natural law, but where does natural law come from? It comes from eternal law. It comes from God. And King's argument was, laws that intentionally harm and degrade persons cannot be a law because laws are meant to promote our good, not perpetuate evil. So what's fascinating is in the history of kind of Christian political thought in society today, there's this idea of like keep religion out of politics, right? The problem is that's usually a statement used by progressives to keep conservative Christians from bringing their views into politics because that's Christian nationalism, right? Okay? The problem is secularists and progressives don't know what to do with Martin Luther King's argument because in the same letter, where does he ground his argument for the natural law and human law and eternal law? In the Christian natural law tradition. Who's he quote? He quotes Augustine and Aquinas. And so this is a demonstration of how, no, you want your religious viewpoints enacted into law where those religious viewpoints accord with principles of the natural law grounded in those Genesis 1 and 2 realities. Number 8. We must protect our souls from the corrosiveness of politics. And I'm going to just make a confession to you all. This is something I really struggle with. I really love politics. I read way too many email newsletters in the morning. I listen to way too many political podcasts. And I can find in my heart sometimes gripped by animosity and contempt when it should be brokenheartedness. Where I should have sorrow, sometimes my heart has rage. I think there's in Mark 8:36, for what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? I think there's an analog for us to think about this with our discipleship as believers. What profits a man to gain the world politically and lose your own soul? So you get the political system you want by any means necessary, without regard to God's laws, without regard to how we treat people. And then all of a sudden what? You have the political system you want, but you got there at the expense of your heart getting more angered and more upset at the world. A friend of mine said this to me, and I was like, I'm writing that down, I'm going to use it. He said this: our activism in the world is only ever as good as our spiritual disciplines. And I think we need to take that to heart. And I'm preaching to the choir right here. That I have to remind myself, before I scroll Twitter or check the New York Times, it's more important that I ground myself in eternal truths with eternal realities before I flip on the political switch. Why? Not because I'm wanting to decrease my concern about politics or to disavow politics, but no, it's what? It's ultimately so that I can order my politics appropriately. The ordo amoris finds a way once again. So this raises the question, what virtues might we be cultivating when it comes to politics? Some questions for us. Do any of us in here have an anonymous social media account that allows you to spew vitriol with supposed anonymity, even though you don't have anonymity because the Lord knows your heart? Are you able to be disagreeable with the people around you? It's okay to disagree. I'm all about some good disagreement, okay? It's a question of, are you cultivating Spirit-led instincts that allow you to be disagreeable and not contemptuous? Another question, have we been so curated and cultivated by social media algorithms and the dopamine hits to our brain that we've lost self-control? Self-control is a fruit of the Spirit. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here. All right, folks, I love politics, okay? You want to have I love having a political discussion. I got takes, okay? A lot of hot takes. scrolling Twitter for an hour mindlessly is probably not the best for my spiritual life. To say nothing of the distraction it poses for my family, for my job, but also, what do I notice happening? Rage grips the heart. Anger grips the heart. So again, these are questions for you to consider, for you to evaluate. Number 9. Is that political engagement is a worthwhile pursuit. Though fallen, politics, as we read in Romans 13, is a legitimate sphere of God's providence. It's there for us to help establish systems of justice and equality under the law for the sake of human flourishing. Meaning that it's a good thing if you're politically engaged. It's a good thing if you're running for office or you are an office holder. If anyone here is a state representative or on your town council, good for you. What are you getting to do? You're getting to steward authority properly. And the reason that political engagement is a worthwhile pursuit is that if you do not influence politics, guess what? Someone else will. Someone else will. Carl Henry, one of my heroes, he said this. He says, if the church fails to apply the central truth of Christianity to social problems correctly, someone else will do so incorrectly. Let me read that one more time. If the church fails to apply the central truth of Christianity to social problems correctly, someone else will do so incorrectly. Nature abhors a vacuum. Something is going to fill the public square. Something is going to be at the center of our concept of the good and the common good. The question is, whose version of the good is going to be dominant and supreme? Whose version of the good is law going to be shaped after? There is no compromise necessarily of being involved with politics as a Christian. That leads to my next point, which is this, is that political power is not bad in and of itself. And I need to probably speak to the Christians in this room because I think a lot of us have imbibed this mentality that political power is inherently corrupting because we follow gentle, lowly Jesus, we do, who said, my kingdom is not of this world, so we view all worldly power as necessarily bad. I don't think that's actually correct. Jesus' kingdom is not of this world. True. That is not a repudiation of political power. It is a repudiation of the corrupt application of power. A quote by a Baptist figure from a few years ago, he said this. He said, there could be no politics at all without power. To speak disparagingly, therefore, of power politics is to reveal a serious lack of understanding of political realities. Political power is the ability to put a policy into effect and to fit that policy into a concrete program. The government of a nation maintains the preponderance of political power. It cannot tolerate any group within the state with more power than that of itself. The moment such a group emerges with more power than the government, it immediately becomes the government. And I love this. As all ice is cold ice, so all politics is power politics. Basically, politics has power as its chief ingredient, compromise as its primary method of getting things done, and the public good as its main purpose. He ends by saying this, in whatever way politics may be defined, it is neither bad enough for Christians to withdraw entirely from it, nor good enough for Christians to feel no necessity for permeating it with their moral leaven. I love that. In whatever politics may be defined, it is neither bad enough for Christians to withdraw, nor is it good enough for you to just feel the need to sit back and not try to influence it at all. So all politics relies upon power. Power itself is morally neutral. The question is the end to which political power is wielded, which is either in the direction of moral goodness and justice or away from moral goodness and justice. I bet there are people in here who would like to run for office potentially. You should do it. You should understand that power, the appropriate application of power vis-a-vis Romans 13, 1 through 4, is God ordained and God instituted. If that's something you're wrestling with, and you feel like it's an inferior calling, that it cheapens and degrades a spiritual calling, you should reevaluate that. We want more Christian magistrates. Not because they'll make the nation necessarily more Christian by way of regeneration and awakenings, but because Christian office holders understand better those foundational principles of Genesis 1 and 2 that every person needs in this world, regardless of whether they're a Christian or not. So why not you? Number 12, or I guess what is that, number 11? The solution to political apathy is not political idolatry. The solution to political apathy is not political idolatry. For some people, we care too much about politics. That's the case for me. Others care too little about politics. That's my wife. Like literally, I have to tell her anything that's going on. Because why? Because she's busy being a mom, being a teacher. Her life doesn't revolve around a 24-hour news cycle like mine does. So she does what she does to stay a little bit more attuned. She listens to like the Daily Wire's morning podcast and Dr. Mueller's briefing podcast. But she's not checking Twitter. Her Instagram feeds are not Charlie Kirk, and TPUSA, and all of those types of accounts. It's like mom blogs, right? That's what she likes to read. Or mom accounts. I don't know the terminology here. I'm exposing my own ignorance. What you have to ask is, where are you on the spectrum? Too much politics or too little politics? Let me just suggest to you, if you're on the too much political side, the best thing you can do is commit to yourself to say, I'm going to open my Bible first before I do my social media feeds. Maybe if it's too little politics, it's to say, all right, what's the one thing I can do to know what's going on in my world? And I would suggest to you, I'm biased in saying this because he's a hero and mentor and friend of mine, but Dr. Albert Mohler's podcast, The Briefing, is outstanding. Everyone in here should be listening to The Briefing. I'm going to be biased again. Y'all should be reading World Opinions online, 3 columns a day on news and current events from a Christian perspective. Take 10 minutes a day and figure out what's going on in your world. Next is keeping politics in proper perspective. Again, Christianity is not chiefly a political program. It is about reconciliation with God, peace with God, union with Christ. But that doesn't mean political evacuation. It means political subordination. Meaning that we could have a lot of Christians in office. We could have great laws in office, and guess what? The world will still be fallen. Because we, as believers, cannot by our own power undo the effects of Genesis 3. Only Christ can. Politics in this age is going to be marked by fallenness. The job of good political orders is to mitigate fallenness rather than it is to put into place expansive laws and expansive forms of government that become overweening and totalitarian and trying to fix everything. It's a happy medium you got to figure out the balance of. Not too much government, not too little government. Carl Henry, I quoted him once already. This is probably like my central quote that defines my ministry. He said this. He said the mission of the church is to, quote, declare the criteria by which the nations will ultimately be judged, and the divine standards to which man and society must conform if civilization is to endure. I love that. To declare the criteria by which the nations will ultimately be judged. That criteria is God's righteousness and his holiness, and the divine standards to which man and society must conform. Man must conform himself to God's moral law. Society must conform himself to God's moral law. But guess what? Man is never going to be able to do that perfectly. Society will never be able to do that perfectly. And so what does that do? That drives us to the gospel. Political despair, a sense of gnawing ache and futility of existing in a political community where there is still fallenness should drive us to the gospel to recognize there are certain things that man-made laws cannot do, and that only regeneration through Christ can. I learned from Pastor Steve yesterday that this is actually a Southern Baptist church, which I was enthused to hear and learn. So the Baptist faith and message, which I subscribe to as a Baptist, I have to teach according to and not, or what's my phrase I have to, at the seminary, teach according to and not, wow, I'm butchering my own confessional statement. Teach in accordance with and not contrary to. There we go. If I teach contrary to, I get fired. So there's that. But the Baptist faith and message says this: means and methods used for the improvement of society and the establishment of righteousness among men can be truly and permanently helpful only when they are rooted in the regeneration of the individual by the saving grace of God and Jesus Christ. I love that. The Baptist faith and message has this great clause about how we should seek to bring influence under the sway of God's righteousness, and we should absolutely get out in society, vote, be salt and light that Christ calls us to be. But Baptists believe that law doesn't actually shape and conform the heart of man. Regeneration ultimately does. That no amount of political morality will rescue man from man's spiritual destitution. Laws, in effect, are just band-aids. Now, they're important band-aids, but they don't fix man's greatest problem. But a heart and conscience transformed by the gospel will seek to model that in our community and in our daily lives, which I think means voting for policies and candidates that best reflect God's moral law. I love Chuck Colson. I quoted him earlier. He said this. He said, the hope that each of us has is not in who governs us, or what laws we pass, or what great things we do as a nation. Our hope is in the power of God working through the hearts of people. And that's where our hope is in this country, and that's where our hope is in this life. Next point. Think globally, act locally. You should care about what's going on at the federal level. But because of how our political culture works right now, and because of our kind of political media culture, we tend to immediately focus on what's going on in Washington and not focusing on what's going on at our local county commissioning boards. We could probably name who the president is, probably name who the governor is and the senators are, but can you name who your mayor is? Can you name who your local representative is? Can you name who your state senator is? Can you name anyone who is on your local school board? Why? Because we tend to federalize our politics where you actually have less control in Washington. You have more direct control here locally, which in Christian thought is a principle of what we call subsidiarity, meaning you can do more locally because you have more power here, you know more people here than what you can do in Washington. A friend of mine said this a few years ago, that you can change the culture of your dinner table more than you can change the culture of Washington, D.C. I think that's a microcosm of what we're thinking about here, where you are more invested you know more intimately, you have proportional more power and ability to fix things than just criticizing a nameless, faceless blob in Washington, D.C. Last point I'll say is this, is that I think the most fundamental divide in politics today is not simply between left and right, although that is important, or crazy versus normal, as I've heard it said. I think that's an actually true axis as well of political tribalization. The fundamental divide is what type of universe individuals believing they inhabit. Do they conceive of morality and justice as something that self-emanates, that comes from a self-sovereign? Or is our account of morality and justice something that comes to us? A non-Christian philosopher by the name of Thomas Sowell, he very helpfully categorized kind of the two basic fundamental polarities that explain political worldviews. He said that you can believe in a constrained understanding of the universe or a constrained versus unconstrained understanding of the universe. What he meant by that is you could be someone who understands that we live in a world of order and pattern, and our job is to align ourselves with that order and pattern. That's the constrained understanding of the universe because morality is imposed on it. And there may be disagreements at the religious level of who that God is, but at least you're understanding that there is some notion of limits and nature and purpose and morality and justice. Or Sowell says you can believe that we are living in an unconstrained universe where reality and morality are endlessly malleable and we conform reality to our desires rather than conforming our desires to order around us. That's the fundamental divide. Let me begin to wrap things up, throwing a lot at you. A few summary statements I want to offer. First, politics is legitimate. It's secondary, but it's significant. It cannot save you. I'll talk about this in the second or third lecture. Politics is often ameliorating the bad. It's often stopping the spread of the rot from spreading any further. Another summary statement, and this is where I kind of like, what's the phrase we're hearing? I want to unburden you from what has been. I want to unburden you from this idea that politics is radical and transformationalist and you have to be watching cable news every single day and the world hangs upon your shoulders. I want to unburden you from that and actually propose to you, and we'll talk about this more second lecture, I believe, is that Christian politics is not radical. Christian politics is actually extraordinarily boring and routine and ordinary because if I'm correct, my thesis is political societies are more organized well in accordance with the ordinary things of Genesis 1 and 2. The assumptions of Genesis 1 and 2 have predominated in our political society as a nation for a long period of time, starting in 1973, I would go back before that. We had racial supremacy laws that were on the books. That's wrong. We had abortion laws on the books. We still do. That's wrong. We have gender insanity laws on the books. Those are wrong. Do you see how the world's strivings against God's order is impacting political societies? All of those realities are grounded in Genesis 1 realities. So what does political witness look like as Christians? It means affirming the goodness of life, the beauty of life. It means affirming the beauty of our maleness and our femaleness. It means affirming the existence of marriage and family. It means affirming the goodness of work and vocation. It means affirming the good of religious liberty. It's not radical. It's about family formation. We're going to talk about Jeremiah 29 in a little bit. Jeremiah 29 will blow your mind about what you're called to do while you are in exile. And guess what? We are in exile right now. We are living in a form of Babylon, but what I would submit to you is that Babylon still belongs to God. Babylon may try to rewrite the laws of nature. Babylon is going to do that in futility. Because why? Because Babylon is not a sovereign. About to end. I'm going to end even like 2 minutes early. You're welcome, okay? So then, why do we engage in politics at the end of the day? Kind of a summary statement. Remembering that Christ is the true King of Kings, Christians act with wisdom. We pursue justice and righteousness for the sake of an earthly common good, with a view towards recognizing how God has ordered and preserved the world for our good, and it's for our good. There is a lot that is beautiful about this life. Just laws bring glory to God. So recognizing how God has ordered and preserved the world for our good, but ultimately for his glory. I truly believe God gets a form of glory from unregenerate people when unregenerate people enact laws that accord with God's natural law, a natural law rooted in what? In God's own nature, in his own righteousness, in his own perfections.